I want to continue down the line of talking about this positive conclusion that Churchland draws for the possibility of reduction. If we can reduce a higher level theory to a lower level theory, if we can reduce psychology and our mental experience to lower level science that's more fine-grained, then maybe we can get a descriptive and a practical benefit from that. So just like the musician, as a child could hear the notes, but it all sort of blended together, could hear the chords but could not discriminate one chord from another, could not discriminate the notes within the chord. If we do come to move closer to a reduction of the mental to the physical, of psychology to physics or neurophysics, neurophysiology, then maybe we get a similar benefit to this. And so maybe we can understand certain things about our psychological experience that say there's a difference in a state of fear and a state of anxiety. At one point, we did not understand that. We come to introspect, to evaluate our qualitative experience and say, well, now we know that there's something different between the experience of having anxiety and the experience of being in fear. And so benefit to our folk psychological theory. It allowed us to discriminate anxiety and fear. But if we're able to do a reduction and use the new theory to describe the world, maybe we can do it in ways that are more accurate than our folk psychology is. So maybe we can say, well, look, when I'm triggered into a flight or fight reflex, when I have that sort of anxiety, I have this hormone cascade, and amongst the hormones I experience are adrenaline and dopamine. Maybe if I can identify a relationship between adrenaline and a certain feeling and dopamine and a certain feeling, I can come to discriminate the difference between being filled with adrenaline and being filled with dopamine. Maybe then I can divide up anxiety in more different ways, more fine-grained ways. I can understand why fear feels different than anxiety, because there's a different complex of adrenaline in relationship to dopamine, and so on. And then maybe eventually I decide, well, now I need a different term altogether. The old terms were not all that good at dividing up the world, and now I can discriminate in a way I could not previously. Based on my qualitative experience, I can now divide things up more fine-grainedly, just as the musician could do. By learning music theory, learning the sounds associated with given notes, given chords, how the notes together sound, and so forth, can now discriminate things in the qualitative experience of the sound that the musician could not previously discriminate. And so maybe by way of a reduction, we get better introspection, a better understanding, a better way of describing and using our qualitative experience that's more fine-grained and hooks up to the world in more useful ways. What good would this be? Well, maybe there's a different treatment. If I'm experiencing anxiety, maybe there are certain things to remove that anxiety. Medications or mindfulness processes, something like this. But maybe I need a different one if I'm experiencing anxiety that's primarily adrenaline-based as opposed to dopamine-based. Maybe I know that anxiety based on adrenaline lasts longer than anxiety based on dopamine. Maybe I put in new terms for an anxiety based on adrenaline and an anxiety based on dopamine. That's the positive conclusion of the reduction. If we can do a successful reduction, and notice, if we now say there are properties we can't reduce, that's a statement about a need for a better reduced theory, reductive theory, a better new theory, the physics, the neurophysiology, or the phenomenology needs to be improved. Then there's the negative conclusion, and that negative conclusion is sort of a question. Do we think that this old theory, or the higher level theory of psychology, folk psychology, does it divide the world in a useful way so that we want to retain any of it when we reduce? Certain things in it are false. We can't reduce it directly. We can reduce it with boundary conditions, limiting assumptions. If lots of it is false, then what we can do is take out part of the new theory, the neurophysiological theory, some parts of that described analogs to what's described in our folk psychology, the mental experiences we have. There are analogs to that. But maybe there's so much falsity in psychology that we need to eliminate it altogether. And so here we go back to the relationship between eliminativism and reductionism. One way that's scientifically respectable to make an eliminativist move is to do a reduction and find that there are problems and then be motivated to make the move to eliminativism. We could eliminate something completely not connected to reductionist moves and do that on a priori metaphysical grounds. Here, the question is, well, maybe psychology ends up being something like witches, right? So we could do this new version of reduction where we have an image which includes terms from our lower level sciences that correspond to, they're analogs of, they mimic the terms in the science of witches, right? But what we found is that, well, anytime we said there was a witch, then what we had was a messy set of analogs, there's a disjunction, and anytime this higher level property of witch, well, what it actually, say that X is witch at the higher level, folk psychological level, well, what I end up finding is that what this reduces to at the level of the image is something like, well, X was a case of ergotism, or X was a case of epilepsy, or X was a case of, and this, even though this property, this disjunctive property, once I take all of these things at the lower level and put them together, what I've done is put together cases of witches, but these things are vastly different. And, a case of an outbreak of ergot is vastly different than a case of epilepsy. And so dividing the world up this way is not useful. And so maybe we find that these higher level properties do something like this, our folk psychological properties. Maybe once we come to realize, say, the difference in an adrenaline-based and a dopamine-based anxiety, we find that, well, really these things are vastly different. Before we were grouping them together, and really we should not be grouping them together because they're very different. And if we don't group them together, then we can make better predictions, right? If I have a case of witches, what do I do about it? Well, it depends on which of these properties is the analog in this case. The analog to witches is this disjunctive property, but in a given case, the analog is going to be one of these or some of these, right? But if I have a case of, well, that person's a witch, and, well, what's going on there is that person has epilepsy, well, what I ought to do about it, prediction, control, explanation, what I ought to do about it is treat that person's epilepsy. If it's a case of ergotism, there's an outbreak of ergot, well, I ought to, remove the grain and not let people eat the ergot-infected grain, right? And so from the property of witches, I don't know what to do. From the image, this other property that's an analog to it, if I were to get rid of, eliminate, I want to eliminate this, there are no such thing as witches, then I can look and say, well, what's going on here? Is this a case of ergotism? Is this a case of epilepsy? And then from that, I can do something more useful. And so this would be motivation for eliminating witches from our ontology. Okay, so then Churchland goes on, having laid out what's meant somewhat rigorously by reduction, we can then go back and evaluate the arguments of Nagle and Jackson. And so, well, first, in response to Nagle, there's 3 responses to Nagle, but the third one is also a response to Jackson, so 2 responses that are just to Nagle. And Churchland says, well, look, Nagle says that qualitative experiences can't be reduced to a lower level theory. And Churchland says, well, this is just false. We reduce qualitative properties to lower level theories all the time. I can give you the mean kinetic energy of something to describe its heat. I can give you the wavelengths reflected by something to give you its color. And so it is possible, and it's actual, right? The best possibility proof is to show that something actually is the case. It is actual that we do reduce qualitative properties to lower level properties. And the problem here is that it was ever put inside the head. The qualitative experience was ever put inside the head and made a subjective property at all. There are objective qualitative properties. I think this is a fair response to Nagle. I don't think it's a full response to Nagle on this point. I think that it could still allow that there are some purely subjective qualitative properties. And then the question is whether we can reduce those. But going back to Nagle, right, again, if there are building blocks, if there's a disjunction of possible things, there's a given set of neurons that underwrite any sort of red experience. The fact that your red experience is different than mine, I could still, once I know the underlying science, capture your subjective experience. I could reduce it. Your current subjective qualitative experience of red reduces to this set of neuron events. My qualitative experience of red reduces to, my subjective qualitative experience of red reduces to a non-identical but not distinct set of neural events. But then, second response to Nagle. We have something like an argument that says, well, qualia are directly known to me, to brain states, right? Qualia is supposed to reduce to brain states. Brain states are not directly knowable by me, are known to me. And wording here matters. But if I say that A and B have some property that they do not share in common, then I conclude that qualia do not equal brain states, right? This is an argument he gives, or this is an argument that Churchland says that he gives. If qualia can be or are directly known by me, and brain states cannot or are not directly known by me, then qualia are not identical to brain states. And then the response, Churchland's response to this is that, well, this is just the case of intentionality, right? The fact that I know something under one description, but fail to know it under a different description, that's a fact about me and not the thing, right? This is the Superman Clark Kent case, the Batman Bruce Wayne case, the Venus Morningstar Evening Star case. All right, we've gone over this, intentionality versus extensionality. This is the response. And then Nagle responds to this and says, well, but this is not a fair representation of my argument. My argument is not that qualia are directly known to me, but qualia can be or possible. They are knowable, directly knowable to me. Brain states are not directly knowable to me. And while known is an intentional property, and therefore I cannot go from the argument in terms of intentional properties to concluding a non-identity between qualia and brain states, knowable is not an intentional property. It's a modal property. And because it's not intentional, the fact that qualia are knowable to me directly, but brain states are not knowable to me directly, means that qualia are not brain states. The argument given first was not a valid argument because the premises could be true and the conclusion would not follow. The second argument is valid. If the premises are true, the conclusion does follow, but as a matter of fact, the second premise is false. Brain states are directly knowable to me. We know lots of brain states directly. I'm looking for her exact case here. He gives example, sorry. It's not Patricia Churchland, it's Paul Churchland. Well, the example given there is that, well, redness, if we look at, rather than brain states, we look at, and qualia, we look at a higher order property and a lower level property. I can know directly that a higher level property is a lower level property. And Well, those are the examples given. But the claim here, as a further response to Nagle, is that, well, there's two versions of the argument. One argument, the first argument has true premises but a false conclusion. The second argument is valid, but it has a false premise, namely that brain states are not directly knowable to me. Right? If I learn enough about neurology, then I can know, say, what happens when I see vertical lines moving horizontally. Certain edge detectors are firing. If I see horizontal lines moving vertical, different edge detectors are moving, or are firing. And so I could know that. I just need more knowledge in order to know that brain state directly. When I have that qualitative experience, that's what's going on with the brain state, so I know it. I know it directly, just by my experience and other background knowledge. But that's true of everything, right? I can know directly that something in front of me is an oak tree, but only when appealed to knowledge about oak trees. I can know directly that the qualitative experience I'm having right now is edge detectors of a certain sort firing, but only with appeal to background knowledge. This is fine. This shows that his second premise is false. So he has a valid argument with a false premise, and he has an invalid argument with true premises. And if you're doing the Qualia paper, you need to look at these responses carefully. I'm going over them a bit quickly. So then the third response to Nagle is also the first response to Jackson, and that's the idea that, well, if the issue is, like the Mary case, that, well, Mary knows all there is to know, she has all of the physical information, and the wording here matters, but then gets out of the room and learns something. Since she learned something, but she had all the physical information, then what she learned was not physical information, and so physical information does not exhaust what there is to know, so physicalism is false. So the obvious response here, that I hope was obvious when you read the Mary case, is, well, there are different kinds of knowledge here. Quite obviously, there are different kinds of knowledge here. Early on in the semester, we talked about the difference between know-how and know-that. Know-that propositional knowledge, know-how has to do with a performance. Well, it seems like something similar is going on here. What Mary had inside the room was all of the propositional knowledge about physics, but did not know how it was to experience something. And so there's two different kinds of knowledge at play here. And if there's two different kinds of knowledge, then first we said she had all the knowledge of a certain sort, and then we're saying she gained knowledge of a different sort, therefore she didn't have all the knowledge. Well, we didn't say she had all the knowledge, we said she had all the knowledge of a certain sort. She gained knowledge of a different sort. Then there's the additional task on Jackson to show that this different sort of knowledge is not physical knowledge. But if we assume that that different kind of knowledge is not physical knowledge, then we've already assumed there's non-physical knowledge, so we cannot conclude from the fact that there is non-physical knowledge that there is non-physical knowledge. We needed that belief in the first place to conclude that. Another response Churchland has to Jackson is that, well, he would prove too much here. He runs the case against Jackson, saying, well, if this argument works for psychology, for, neuroscience, had all the neuroscience information but gained some new information, it could also work against dualism. If it works against dualism, then we've shown by the first argument that physicalism is false. We've shown by the second argument that dualism is false, but the point of showing physicalism false was to arrive at, deliver epiphenomenalism, or something with a non-physical property, to show there was some emergent non-physical property. But now we've gotten rid of dualism. There aren't two different kinds of properties, because this argument works against dualism too. Jackson has a response that says this doesn't work with dualism. Maybe that's right, maybe it's not. But it does seem that you could run this argument against things it shouldn't work for, like biology. So Mary is a biologist in the room, knows all there is to know about biology, but has not experienced any animals. Gets out of the room and experiences an animal. Now, what? Mary knows something she didn't know before? Well, before she was just reading books, she had not experienced animals, so she had not seen pictures of animals, she had only read biological papers. Now she experiences an animal, and a bunch of knowledge she had comes together and knows what it's like to see something that is a mammal, that has fur, that is a female, that has canines, and so forth. Presumably, Mary did not put all this information together and could imagine. If she could, do that in the room, then she could do it with qualitative experiences. If she didn't, she learned something new. But we're not going from that to conclude that, well, there is non-biological information. When I see a dog, I learn something that's not biological. It doesn't seem right. And so it seems like this argument could be run against biology and the fact that we can't reduce biology because there's some fact that's non-biological there. But the dog, the appearance of the dog is a biological fact, qualitative fact. I don't know. You can make your conclusions here based on the interchange between Jackson and Churchland. But it seems that when we get out of the room, Mary experiences something she didn't before. From that, does she have knowledge she had before, or does she really now understand what it is to have that knowledge sort of embodied in her? Before, she knew what kind of firing in her brain would occur were she to see red. But that had never been in her brain. Now she knows what it's like to have that experience, those neuronal firings in her, embodied in her brain. Is that learning something new? If so, is that new thing a physical thing? If so, she didn't have all the physical knowledge in the first place. Maybe she had all the physical propositional knowledge, but not all the physical experiential knowledge. Another thing we could say here is that, well, what Mary learns is a new way to think of, describe, capture what she already knew. What we're saying, these higher level qualitative experiences just are ways of capturing or describing the world, and those ways of describing the world, the qualitative ways of dividing the world up, can be reduced to physical ways of dividing the world up. We're referring to the same thing by the physical description and the mental description, but we're referring in a different way. Maybe they have a different sense connected to them. This is the intentionality extensionality issue. She did not learn that there's a new thing in the world. She did not learn a new fact extensionally about the world. She had something different intentionally about her. And so this is like learning a new name. You know, if you learn a new name about someone, you have not learned a new thing about you have not learned a new physical fact about the person. But to say that we've learned a new name about a person, a new way to describe a person, do we say that we've learned non-physical knowledge there? It doesn't seem right. And so what we're learning is maybe something like a way of describing, a way of capturing, a way of approaching a pattern that wasn't there before, right? So if I teach you a different way of doing division, right? Instead of going from right to left, you go from left to right. Have I taught you anything new about division? It's a new way of approaching. But you knew before how to do division. You had those mathematical facts. Did I teach you new mathematical facts, or is it a heuristic, a different way of approaching the same mathematical facts? So if I give you a new way of describing the world, have I really given you new knowledge about the world, or just a different way of dividing up knowledge you already have? And the big catch here is a conceptual framework, right? The musician, the professional musician, had a different conceptual framework than did the amateur. And because of that, could divide up the exact same input differently. The amateur, the professional musician have the same input. They're listening to the same symphony. But they divide it up differently. They divide it up differently because they have different conceptual frameworks. When Mary gets out, she gets a different conceptual framework, a different way of dividing up the world. The same input, divided up differently. Is this a non-physical fact? This is what has to carry the day. We say, oh, well, you know, a conceptual framework is non-physical. Well, is it? I mean, conceptual framework is a way of processing things. The way of processing things would have a reduction. That is, there are certain neuronal events in a certain order that make sense of the world in a certain way, that are a conceptual framework. There's something in the neurons that happen. You modify firing potentials. So I don't know how much progress we've made in this direction, because in order to prove that physicalism is false, we have to say that there's knowledge gained for Mary outside the room that she did not have previously. But if we say that's non-physical knowledge, it seems like we are already believing there was non-physical knowledge. If we're believing there was non-physical knowledge, we cannot use that to prove there's non-physical knowledge. She gains something, but then there's the additional task of showing that that thing she gains is non-physical knowledge. That is knowledge not about the physical world. That's a task still to be done. We cannot, on scientific grounds, say there's a problem there, it's difficult. It is difficult. We don't yet know how to reduce qualia. But we cannot from that say that therefore we can't reduce qualia, physicalism is false. That's non-scientific. Rather, we try, if we fail, we try something different. That's the way it works. And so one positive proposal we've seen in a number of places here is phenomenology. If we could develop a science to divide up qualia more narrowly, our qualitative experiences, into a certain set of building blocks, then I could talk to you in purely qualitative terms and describe to you the building blocks that make up my experience of this red, and you could do the same. And then we could determine how it is that you experience differently than me. And if I understand those building blocks and I've trained myself to understand, divide my qualitative experience more narrowly, I could, presumably, through imagination, then take away the building blocks I'm using that you aren't and add in the building blocks you're using that I'm not. And therefore, I could imagine or experience how you experience the world with red. You look at red is different than what you experience when you look at red is different than what I experience when I look at red. Okay, but if I can develop a phenomenology, science of phenomenal experience, get building blocks, I can then ask you about that. We're both professional phenomenologists. You can describe your experience of red in terms of the building blocks. I can describe my experience of red in terms of the building blocks. We can then realize that we have different experiences of red. I can subtract the building blocks I'm using that you aren't, put in the building blocks you're using that I'm not, and then I can experience red just as you experience red. And the way to get here is to combine neuroscience with phenomenology. Phenomenology is historically a science, not well developed, still in its infancy. Recently, neurophenomenology has become an area of study. And it seems even Nagle, who's very much against physicalism currently, says that we cannot reduce qualia, and therefore we cannot reduce consciousness, and therefore we cannot reduce mental experience, and therefore we cannot reduce the mind, and therefore we cannot reduce psychology. Strong claims. He says, that's a fact about right here, right now, what we cannot do. It's a difficult task, hard problem. If we can all be honest and open and fair about what the hard problem is, then we can learn to deal with the hard problem, or at least understand what it would mean to tackle this hard problem and come up with a solution to it, as opposed to conclude dualism from the fact that there's currently a problem. We can't say dualism is true because it's currently a problem, because that's not scientific. It's on scientific grounds, but that's not the way science works. That's bad science. We can't conclude dualism on metaphysical grounds because we're already concerned with giving a scientific account of mind. So even Nagle, who's a skeptic about physicalism right here, right now, Jackson is maybe even more staunch of a critic against physicalism. But Nagle allows that we could learn something from developing a phenomenology that would divide up our qualitative experience into building blocks, make them in a way that we can describe the world scientifically, based on qualia. The ontology of a phenomenology would be qualitative. Then, once we have that, we can look at the relationship between the entities and the laws in that qualitative science of phenomenology and how they match up to the lower level theory of neurophysiology. And Churchland says, well, maybe the negative conclusion is that folk psychology is not a good way of dividing up the world, and maybe we want to eliminate it. Okay, one thing we can do is That does not mean that we have to eliminate consciousness or qualitative experience. Remember, I said no one does that. No, what we are eliminating is the science that purports to describe it, because it does not describe right, it describes falsely. We put in its place a different science, phenomenology. Phenomenology might describe it well enough, accurately enough, that then we can do a reduction, and we're not reducing something vastly false to something true. Okay, next week or next video, hopefully up tomorrow, naturalism, McGinn versus Flanagan, and close up the whole discussion about a science of the mind and where we stand currently, or at least 15 years ago, with a science of the mind.